7 disasters. 7 moments when something built to fly became something that killed, each one worse than the last. In nearly every case, someone knew. A warning was issued, an engineer said stop, and the machine kept moving anyway. These are the 7 most devastating aerospace disasters in recorded history, and they only get increasingly devastating. The Hindenburg Disaster, 1937. To understand why the Hindenburg disaster shocked the world the way it did, you first have to understand what the Hindenburg actually was, because it was not simply a blimp. The LZ-129 Hindenburg was 804 feet long, longer than 3 Boeing 747s placed end-to-end, and just 80 feet shorter than the Titanic. It was the largest aircraft ever constructed, and in the mid-1930s, it was also the most luxurious. Passengers aboard it traveled in private cabins, ate in a full dining room with white tablecloths and silver cutlery, lounged in a carpeted sitting room with a grand piano, and watched the Atlantic Ocean slide past through panoramic windows from an altitude of 650 feet. There was even a pressurized smoking lounge, which sounds like the most dangerous amenity imaginable on an airship filled with gas. But it was sealed and carefully engineered so that no open flame could reach the gas envelope above. The Hindenburg had completed 10 round trips between Europe and the United States in 1936 without a single serious incident. By 1937, a transatlantic crossing by airship was considered a routine. It was the pinnacle of what German engineering and Nazi government investment had produced, and it was treated accordingly as a propaganda tool as much as a transport vehicle. Its photograph appeared in newspapers around the world, and its silhouette was recognizable to people who had never flown on anything. Beneath all of this, however, was a problem that the people in charge knew about and had tried to solve. The Hindenburg was designed from the very beginning to be filled with helium, which is non-flammable and chemically inert. Helium was always the safe choice, and the engineers who built it knew that. But in the 1930s, the United States held a near-total global monopoly on commercial helium supplies, and American authorities had imposed an export embargo preventing any sale of helium to Nazi Germany. So, the engineers substituted. They filled the airship's 16 enormous gas cells with hydrogen instead. Approximately 7 million cubic feet of it. Hydrogen is not inert. Hydrogen burns. Every person with authority over the Hindenburg knew this, and the airship flew anyway, 10 times across the Atlantic without incident, which is the kind of record that makes dangerous things feel safe. On May 3rd, 1937, the Hindenburg departed Frankfurt, carrying 36 passengers and 61 crew members on its 63rd flight overall, at its first North American crossing of the year. The destination was Lakehurst Naval Air Station in New Jersey. The flight across the Atlantic was largely uneventful, but bad weather over New Jersey delayed the approach by several hours, and by the time the airship descended towards its mooring mast on the evening of May 6th, a line of thunderstorms had just swept through the area. The ground crew at Lakehurst noticed that the air felt electrically charged. The ground was wet. At 7:25 p.m., as the Hindenburg descended toward the mooring mast and the ground crew reached up for the handling lines, something ignited near the tail section. The fire spread from the tail section forward across the 804-foot length of the ship in approximately 32 to 34 seconds. The entire vessel fell 200 feet to the ground while still burning. Watching the film footage today, what strikes you is not the scale of it, but the speed. One moment, the Hindenburg is there, enormous and silver against the evening sky, and then it's not. The cause has never been officially confirmed, but that ambiguity has persisted for nearly 90 years. The leading scientific theory points to a buildup of static electricity on the outer skin of the airship, which may have ignited a small hydrogen leak near the rear gas cells during the mooring maneuver. But a second theory has never been entirely dismissed. Ernst Spell was a rigger on the Hindenburg's crew. By multiple accounts, he was a young man with deep anti-Nazi sympathies, and his girlfriend had documented connections to anti-fascist organizations in Germany. Several investigators over the decades have pointed to Spell as a potential saboteur who may have planted a timing device inside the rear gas cell area. He died in the disaster, which means he also never spoke. The German government, for its part, was not interested in any narrative that embarrassed the Reich. It dismissed the sabotage theory, suppressed newsreel footage of the crash until after World War II, and treated the dead as heroes of the German state. The cause of the Hindenburg fire remains technically an open question. 36 people died, 13 passengers, 22 crew members, and 1 member of the ground crew. But here's what still surprises people. 62 of the 79 people aboard survived, more than 60%. The physics of hydrogen combustion partially explains this. Hydrogen burns upward rather than outward, which meant that the initial fireball rose away from passenger decks. The airship's tail also struck the ground first, holding the bow section elevated long enough for some passengers to jump or slide to safety before it too came down. A steward named Heinrich Kubis, who had served aboard the Hindenburg since its earliest flights, jumped from a window when the ship was still approximately 20 feet off the ground and walked away with burns. Several other passengers and crew were found wandering the airfield in shock, soot-covered but alive, in the minutes after the collapse. What the survival count cannot capture is what it meant for the world watching. Radio reporter Herbert Morrison had traveled to Lakehurst from WLS Chicago to record what was supposed to be a routine mooring. When the fire started, he kept recording. His broadcast, aired coast to coast the following day, produced a phrase that had become the signature of a generation's relationship with disaster journalism. Oh, the humanity. Morrison broke down completely on air, his voice cracking over millions of household radios, transmitted the horror in real time, which had never happened before with a disaster of this scale. The Hindenburg was the first major catastrophe to be captured on both film and audio, and the combination of those two records made it the most viscerally documented disaster that the world had yet seen. The consequences were total and permanent. The era of rigid passenger airships ended on May 6, 1937, and it has never resumed. No rigid airship has carried commercial passengers since. The technology that had seemed like the future of transatlantic travel was gone almost overnight, replaced within the decade by propeller aircraft and eventually by jets. The Hindenburg was a pinnacle of airship design and the last of its kind simultaneously. 36 dead and a fire that lasted 34 seconds. And yet, compared to what comes next, the Hindenburg barely opens the account. The de Havilland Comet disasters, 1953 to 1954. In the years after World War II, Britain needed something to prove. The war had broken the country financially, the empire was cracking, and the Americans and Soviets had absorbed most of the world's attention. What Britain still had was engineering talent, and in the late 1940s, that talent was directed towards something that would redefine commercial aviation. The world's first jet-powered passenger airliner, the de Havilland Comet, entered service in May 1952, and by every available measure, it was extraordinary. It flew at twice the speed of the propeller aircraft that had dominated commercial aviation since the war, and it cruised at twice their altitude, above the weather systems and turbulence that made long-haul flying miserable. Journeys that had taken the better part of a day with multiple stops now felt almost effortless. British newspapers celebrated it as proof that Britain still led the world. The Americans had nothing like it. The Soviets had nothing like it. Nobody did. BOAC, the British state carrier, flew it on routes across Asia, Africa, and eventually toward the transatlantic market, and passengers paid premium prices to be aboard it. The Comet was a remarkable technological achievement and also a national statement. And then, the Comet started falling out of the sky. The first crash came on May 2nd, 1953. BOAC Flight 783 departed Calcutta during a severe thunderstorm and broke apart in flight in just 6 minutes after takeoff. All 43 people aboard died. The investigation attributed the breakup to overstress from the storm environment, either extreme gusts loading or the pilot pulling too hard against the turbulence. It was disturbing, but the conclusion pointed toward conditions rather than the aircraft itself. The Comet fleet kept flying. Then came January 10th, 1954. BOAC Flight 781 had departed Rome's Ciampino Airport and was climbing through 27,000 feet, with its radio transmission cut off mid-sentence. The crew had been relaying a routine position report to another BOAC aircraft below them. The last words received were, "Did you get my?" The sentence never finished. Eyewitnesses on the Italian island of Elba looked up and saw the aircraft descending in pieces through clear sky, trailing fire, and hitting the Tyrrhenian Sea. All 35 people aboard died. This was a different category of event. The aircraft had not flown into a thunderstorm or encountered extreme turbulence. It had broken apart at cruise altitude on a clear day without issuing any distress call and without any warning of any kind. In 1954, there were no flight data recorders and no cockpit voice recorders. The wreckage was scattered across the floor of the Mediterranean. Nobody had any reliable way to determine what had happened, and the investigation said as much. Despite this, BOAC ungrounded the Comet fleet 10 weeks after the crash. The airline's chairman appeared on television and stated that they would not be flying the Comet if conditions were not suitable. The fleet returned to service. 17 days after the fleet returned to service, on April 8, 1954, South African Airways Flight 201 departed Rome for Cairo. Last radio contact was recorded at 35,000 feet. The wreckage was later found near the volcanic island of Stromboli. All 21 people aboard were dead. 3 crashes, 99 total fatalities. All 3 aircraft had disintegrated at altitude without warning, without a distress call, and without any mechanical event that ground crews had detected before departure. The Comet was grounded permanently, and the most consequential aircraft incident investigation in aviation history began. It was led by Sir Arnold Hall of the Royal Aircraft Establishment at Farnborough, and the core problem he faced was that the science needed to solve it barely existed. Hall's team devised a test that had never been attempted at this scale. They took an entire Comet fuselage, the airframe designated GALYU, placed it inside a purpose-built water tank, and repeatedly pressurized and depressurized it to simulate the pressure cycles of climbing to altitude and descending again. They used water instead of air because water is incompressible, meaning that when the structure eventually failed, it would rupture rather than explode, allowing investigators to examine the failure point intact. After 3,057 simulated flight cycles, the fuselage burst open at a window corner. The answer, when they found it, was both elegant and devastating. The Comet's cabin windows were square. Squares have corners, and corners concentrate stress. Every time the aircraft climbed to altitude and the fuselage pressurized, the pressure pushed hardest against those corners, right at the rivet holes in the window frames. No single flight caused visible damage, but each flight opened the cracks at those rivet holes a tiny fraction further, and after enough cycles, the cracks had grown long enough that the fuselage could no longer hold the pressure. When that threshold was crossed, the aircraft tore itself apart from the inside in under a second. This process is called metal fatigue. The phenomenon had been observed in other engineering fields before 1954, but nobody had understood how it worked inside a pressurized aircraft fuselage flying thousands of altitude cycles. The Comet had been pressure tested at 2.5 times its design limit before entering service and passing. But a single pressure test, no matter how extreme, tells you nothing about what happens to a structure that is pressurized and depressurized thousands of times over years of service. The science of testing for that kind of cumulative failure, in pressured aircraft specifically, did not exist as a formal discipline before Hall's team at Farnborough built it from scratch. His decision to return the Comet to service after the first 1954 crash remains the most damaging institutional choice in this case. 10 weeks had passed. The investigation had found no definitive cause. The chairman went on television. 17 days after re-entry into service, another Comet broke apart and killed everyone aboard. The pattern of continuing operations under incomplete information because the cost of stopping feels too high is one across aerospace history, and it costs the same price every time. The legacy of these crashes is written into every commercial aircraft flying today. Look at the windows on any airplane that you've ever boarded. They are oval or rounded at every edge. That shape is a direct consequence of what killed 99 people between 1953 and 1954. Mandatory fatigue testing was established as a global certification requirement for all commercial aircraft. The investigative methodology that Hall's team developed at Farnborough had become the template for aircraft accident investigation worldwide. De Havilland never recovered its commercial position. Boeing and Douglas stepped into the jet age that the Comet had pioneered, and Britain's lead in commercial aviation evaporated. 99 people died solving a problem that nobody knew existed, and every person who has ever boarded a commercial flight safely has benefited from that knowledge without ever knowing it. Nobody could identify the cause of the 3 crashes until the science to find it was literally invented from scratch. However, the next case is different in a way that is harder to sit with. The people who died in it were not killed by unknown science. They were killed by known risks that had been documented, reported, filed, inside an institution that kept moving anyway. The Apollo Fire, 1967. By 1966, NASA was running much more than a space program. It was running a race. On May 25, 1961, President Kennedy had committed the United States to landing a man on the moon before the end of the decade, a promise made not for specific reasons, but as a direct response to the Soviet Union's early dominance in space. That promise gave NASA 8 years to accomplish something that had never been done, using technology that barely existed yet, while a rival superpower was racing to beat them to it. Inside NASA, caution was a luxury nobody felt they could afford. The crew assigned to Apollo 1, the first crewed Apollo mission, reflected the best the program had. Gus Grissom was a veteran of Mercury and Gemini, the second American ever to reach space, and the man most widely considered within NASA to be the likely commander of the first lunar landing mission if Apollo succeeded. Ed White was the first American to walk in space, having spent 23 minutes outside the Gemini 4 capsule in June 1965. Roger Chaffee was the youngest of the 3, a rookie who had spent 5 years in the astronaut program and had never yet flown in space. He had been waiting for this mission. On January 27, 1967, 3 men were sealed inside the Apollo 1 command module at Launch Complex 34, Cape Kennedy, running what NASA called a plugs-out test, a ground simulation of launch day conditions. The cabin was pressurized with pure oxygen at 16.7 pounds per square inch, slightly above normal atmospheric pressure. Pure oxygen had been standard NASA practice since the Mercury program. It simplified the life support system, reduced weight, and had never caused serious problems. The test was supposed to be routine.
Once the men were inside, the capsule would be pressurized with pure oxygen, creating the same conditions as the Russian isolation chamber. This would be the last time anyone saw the 3 men alive.
It had not been going well. Communication dropouts and static had plagued the simulation throughout the afternoon. Grissom was openly frustrated. He had, in a gesture that was not subtle, hung a lemon on the spacecraft's instrument panel before climbing in, a direct comment on his assessment of the hardware's condition. The night before, veteran astronaut Wally Schirra had pulled him aside. Schirra had flown in the same spacecraft during earlier ground tests and had developed what he had described as bad feelings about it. His exact words to Grissom were, "If you get the slightest glitch, get out." Grissom told him he understood. The test went ahead. At 6:31 p.m., technicians and controllers monitoring the communications heard a voice from inside the sealed module. "There's a fire in here." Seconds later, it became louder. A different voice. "We've got a bad fire. Let's get out. We're burning up." Then, nothing. Communication from inside the capsule was lost within 17 seconds of the first report.
There was great confusion on the intercom loops. I was listening to the test conductor. I was listening to the voice loop from the astronauts inside the spacecraft.
Shortly thereafter, then there was the call of something like fire in the spacecraft.
I thought I heard some high-pitched voices. I thought I heard somebody say, "We're on fire."
What happened inside that cabin in those 17 seconds was the product of several design decisions that should have never been permitted to coexist in the same vehicle. The command module contained over 70 feet of Velcro strips, nylon netting, and foam padding, materials selected for their practicality in zero gravity. In a standard atmosphere, these materials are mildly flammable. In a pure oxygen environment, at above atmospheric pressure, their ignition temperature drops by approximately 60%, meaning materials that would smolder slowly in air would ignite violently and propagate fire at a speed that leaves no time to respond. The spark that triggered the fire almost certainly came from frayed or damaged wiring beneath Grissom's seat, wiring that maintenance technicians working for prime contractor North American Aviation had flagged as problematic in reports that had not been adequately addressed. The hatch ensured that none of them would escape. It was designed to open inward and into the cabin, which meant that any increase in internal pressure would press it more firmly against its frame. A fire in a sealed oxygen-rich environment generates both heat and pressure. By the time the fire had been burning for several seconds, the internal pressure had risen to the point where the hatch physically could not be opened from inside, regardless of the force applied. Under normal conditions, with no fire and no pressure differential, the hatch required a minimum of 90 seconds to open. The crew never had 90 seconds. The official cause of death for all three men was cardiac arrest from carbon monoxide inhalation. Grissom had suffered third-degree burns from across more than a third of his body. When the recovery teams finally opened the hatch, they found that the nylon material in the spacesuits had melted and fused to the interior surfaces of the cabin. It took nearly 90 minutes to remove the crew. The investigation that followed did not reveal a surprise. It revealed a pattern. A 1966 internal memorandum had explicitly identified the fire hazard posed by the pure oxygen cabin environment. The dangerous inward opening hatch design had been raised as a concern by multiple engineers. The deteriorating quality of North American Aviation's workmanship on the spacecraft had been documented and reported up the chain, and those reports had produced meetings and discussions, but not the kind of corrective action that would have changed the hardware. NASA knew about the risk of a cabin fire in a pure oxygen atmosphere. NASA knew the hatch could not be opened quickly from the inside. NASA knew about the wiring deficiencies. Still, the program kept moving because the schedule demanded it. The congressional hearings that followed were devastating for NASA leadership. Multiple senior officials resigned or were reassigned. The contract with North American Aviation was restructured. More than 1,700 changes were made to the command module, including a new outward opening hatch that could be opened in under 3 seconds, the replacement of flammable materials throughout the cabin, and the substitution of a mixed oxygen-nitrogen atmosphere at sea level in place of pure oxygen. The program was delayed by 18 months. Apollo 11 landed on the moon July 20th, 1969, less than 2.5 years after the fire. Some aerospace historians have argued that the forced overhaul of the program produced precisely the quality of hardware that made the moon landing achievable. Grissom had once said in an interview, well before January 1967, that the conquest of space was worth the risk of life. What he could not have known was that the risk waiting for him was not in the vacuum above the atmosphere. It was in the oxygen-saturated air inside a sealed metal capsule sitting on a launch pad in Florida, built by a contractor whose deficiency reports had not been acted upon. Launch Complex 34 at Cape Canaveral still stands today. It has never been demolished and never been repurposed. Behind a chain-link fence, slowly being reclaimed by Florida vegetation, it holds a single granite plaque. It reads, Launch Complex 34, Friday, 27th of January 1967, 1831 hours, dedicated to the living memory of the crew of the Apollo 1. 3 men died in a sealed cabin on a launch pad in Florida, and a warning that had been written down and filed was ignored. Now, the next case takes every one of those elements and multiplies them by 7 on live television in front of millions of children who had been brought to their classroom TVs specifically to watch. The Space Shuttle Challenger disaster, 1986. By January 1986, the Space Shuttle had flown 24 successful missions. It had become so familiar a fixture of American public life that the excitement of its early flights had faded into something closer to routine institutional confidence. Challenger itself had flown 9 times. The orbiter had become a known quantity. That familiarity, as it does with dangerous systems operated by institutions under pressure, had begun to quietly reshape what the people running the program considered acceptable. The crew of STS-51L was 7 people. Commander Dick Scobie was a former Air Force test pilot and Vietnam combat veteran. Pilot Michael Smith held a degree in naval science and had earned the Distinguished Flying Cross. Mission specialists Judith Resnick, Ellison Onizuka, and Ronald McNair were each accomplished scientists and veterans of previous shuttle missions. Payload specialist Gregory Jarvis was a satellite engineer from Hughes Aircraft. And then there was Krista McAuliffe, a 37-year-old high school social studies teacher from Concord, New Hampshire, who had been selected from more than 11,000 applicants for NASA's Teacher in Space program. The program existed to rebuild public enthusiasm for spaceflight by sending a civilian educator into orbit. McAuliffe was warm, articulate, and deeply committed to her work. She had been preparing lessons she intended to teach from space. Her presence on this mission had guaranteed something no press release could engineer: millions of American school children who had been brought to gymnasium and classroom television sets specifically to watch her launch. The launch had been delayed multiple times due to weather and minor technical issues. By the night of January 27th, the pressure to fly the following morning was significant, and that night, at a teleconference that would become one of the most exhaustively studied management conversations in engineering history, the engineers at Morton Thiokol, the manufacturer of the shuttle's solid rocket boosters, told NASA explicitly not to launch. The concern was the O-ring seals. These were rubber components designed to prevent hot combustion gases from escaping through the joints connecting sections of the solid rocket boosters. The engineers had data showing that these O-rings became less pliable and therefore less effective as seals when exposed to cold temperatures. Their documented lower threshold for launch recommendation was 53 degrees Fahrenheit, and even that number was based on limited data points. The O-rings had never been tested below 40 degrees. The overnight temperature forecast at Kennedy Space Center for January 28th was 28 degrees Fahrenheit, 30 degrees below their minimum recommendation. The engineers argued in clear terms that launching under those conditions placed the crew in a risky situation with no validated safety data to support it. NASA managers pushed back. The conversation that followed has been described by participants as unlike any engineering review they'd ever experienced, one in which the normal burden of proof was inverted. Instead of being asked to demonstrate that the vehicle was safe to fly, the engineers found themselves being asked to prove that it was unsafe, a reversal of the standard logic of engineering and risk management. Under that pressure, Morton Thiokol management overruled their own engineers and provided NASA with the launch authorization it needed. One of the engineers who had argued most forcefully against the launch was Bob Ebeling. He drove to work the following morning and told his daughter before leaving home, "We are going to have a catastrophic event today." Challenger lifted off at 11:38 a.m. on January 28, 1986. Icicles had formed on the launch structure overnight. The temperature at liftoff was 28 degrees Fahrenheit, the coldest launch in shuttle history. 73 seconds into the flight, at an altitude of approximately 46,000 feet, an O-ring seal on the right solid rocket booster failed. The O-ring had been unable to seat properly in the cold, and hot combustion gas at temperatures exceeding 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit reached the joint. The escaping gas stream cut into the external liquid hydrogen tank, which ruptured. The aerodynamic forces acting on the vehicle at that moment caused the orbiter to break apart almost instantaneously. The fireball that cameras captured was never an explosion in the conventional sense. It was the external tank failing and the orbiter being shredded by the resulting aerodynamic stress. The crew cabin was not destroyed in this event. It separated from the disintegrating vehicle as a largely intact unit and continued upward on its own ballistic arc, reaching an estimated peak altitude of 65,000 feet before beginning to fall into the Atlantic Ocean. When investigators recovered 4 of the 6 crew personal egress air packs from the wreckage at the ocean floor, 3 of them had been manually activated. Someone in that cabin was conscious and alive after the breakup, attempting to breathe from an emergency air supply. The cabin hit the ocean surface at a speed calculated at approximately 207 miles per hour. The fall lasted 2 minutes and 45 seconds. NASA had removed the shuttle's ejection seats after the first 4 flights, when crew sizes expanded beyond 2 people, and no alternative escape system had been developed to replace them. There was nothing any of the 7 crew members could have done from the moment the O-ring failed. The Rogers Commission investigation that followed was thorough, and in its findings about institutional behavior, deeply uncomfortable for NASA. It had found that the agency had been aware of the O-ring erosion problems since 1977, 9 years before the disaster. Engineers had documented instances of O-ring damage after previous cold weather flights. NASA had reviewed this data internally multiple times and concluded each time that the damage was within an acceptable range and continued flying. Sociologist Diane Vaughan, in her definitive study of the disaster published in 1996, gave this process a name: a normalization of deviance. A deviation from safe design is repeated often enough and tolerated often enough that it stops being experienced as a deviation. It becomes the new normal until the day it kills people. Physicist Richard Feynman, serving on the Rogers Commission, did not wait for the formal report to make his point. During a televised hearing, he asked for a glass of ice water, placed an O-ring sample in it, and demonstrated on camera that the rubber lost its elastic resilience at low temperatures. The cause of the entire disaster communicated in under 30 seconds using a glass of water and a rubber ring in front of a congressional panel and the watching public. Feynman subsequently wrote an appendix to the commission's report that NASA initially attempted to have removed. It ended with a sentence that has since become one of the most cited lines in history of engineering safely. For a successful technology, reality must take precedence over public relations, for nature cannot be fooled. The shuttle program was grounded for 32 months. Boosters were redesigned. Crew escape systems were installed. Bob Ebeling carried the weight of that morning for 30 years. On the 30th anniversary of the disaster in 2016, he gave an interview in which he said he had lived with the belief that he had not done enough to stop the launch, that he should have been more forceful, and that the deaths of the 7 crew members were in some part his responsibility. He died 5 weeks after giving that interview. He was 89 years old. He had spent 3 decades believing he had failed, when what he had actually done was exactly what an engineer is supposed to do. He told the truth. He had simply been overruled. And that lesson, the one written in the deaths of 7 people on live television after engineers explicitly said do not launch, would be formally studied, memorialized, and then 17 years later, completely forgotten. But that comes later in this list. 7 people died even though it was predicted the night before by the people who built the hardware, and yet the next case killed more than 80 times as many people in a single afternoon on a runway in the Canary Islands. The Tenerife Airport Disaster, 1977. March 27, 1977. The deadliest day in commercial aviation history. Nearly 50 years later, it still holds that record, and the facts surrounding it have a quality that is difficult to process, because neither of the 2 aircraft that collided that day was supposed to be at the airport where it happened. And unlike the others, this disaster did not begin with a mechanical failure or a design flaw. It began with a bomb planted by a separatist group on a different island. That morning, the Canarian separatist group MPA-IAC detonated a bomb inside the terminal building at Las Palmas Airport on the island of Gran Canaria. The explosion injured 8 people and forced the airport to close, while authorities searched for a second device they had been warned about. Dozens of aircraft approaching Gran Canaria were diverted to alternate airports across the region. 2 of them, both Boeing 747s on charter operations, were sent to Los Rodeos Airport on the nearby island of Tenerife. Los Rodeos was a small regional airport with a single runway. It was not designed to accommodate multiple wide-body jets simultaneously, and as more diverted aircraft arrived throughout the morning, the aprons and taxiways filled beyond capacity. Aircraft that had nowhere else to park were positioned on sections on the main runway itself, which meant that any departing or arriving aircraft had to navigate around them. The airport had no ground radar. The control tower had no means of tracking aircraft positions on the runway surface during periods of reduced visibility. The 2 aircraft at the center of what followed were KLM Flight 4805 and Pan American Flight 1736. KLM 4805 was a charter from Amsterdam carrying 248 people, 234 passengers, and 14 crew. Its captain was Jacob Van Zanten, KLM's most senior active pilot, the airline's chief of flight training, and the public face of KLM safety record. His photograph appeared on KLM advertising materials. He was by every institutional measure available, the man who represented what KLM wanted the world to believe about its standards. Pan Am 1736 was carrying 396 people, 380 passengers, and 16 crew on a charter from Los Angeles, commanded by Captain Victor Grubbs. an experienced pilot with 30 years in the air. Hours passed at Los Rodeos. Gran Canaria eventually reopened, and both aircraft prepared to depart. By this point, Van Zanten had made a decision that would prove consequential. He had used the delay at Tenerife to refuel the KLM aircraft completely, topping off tanks that had not needed refueling. The refueling took time, which meant the Pan Am aircraft, which had been cleared to leave first, could not do so because the KLM plane was blocking its path. Van Zanten's refueling decision was driven by a real concern about Dutch aviation duty time regulations that would legally prohibit his crew from operating the return flight if they were delayed much further. But it also meant that when the two aircraft were finally ready to depart, a dense bank of fog had rolled down from the surrounding hills and settled across the runway. Visibility dropped to under 100 meters in places, approximately 330 feet. The control tower could not see either aircraft from its position. Both 747s were instructed to taxi using the runway itself because the taxiways were blocked by parked aircraft. The KLM plane went first, taxiing to the far end for takeoff. The Pan Am plane followed behind it, instructed to exit the runway via a taxiway partway along its length. In the fog, with the control tower blind and both aircraft communicating over the same radio frequency, the sequence of events that followed compressed into approximately 60 seconds of accumulated misunderstandings. Van Zanten initiated his takeoff roll before receiving explicit takeoff clearance from the tower. At some point during the taxi sequence, his first officer had asked the tower whether the Pan Am aircraft had cleared the runway. The question was acknowledged in ambiguous terms. Van Zanten dismissed it and pushed the throttles forward. At almost exactly the same moment, the Pan Am crew, who had missed their assigned taxiway exit in the fog and were still on the active runway, transmitted their position on the radio. That transmission arrived at the KLM cockpit simultaneously, with a separate transmission from the control tower. The two signals overlapping in a phenomenon called a radio squeal that prevented either message from being heard clearly by either recipient. KLM 4805 was traveling at approximately 160 miles per hour when the Pan Am 747 materialized out of the fog directly ahead. Pan Am captain Victor Grubbs saw the KLM aircraft coming and said, "God damn, that son of a bitch is coming straight at us." Both crews had approximately 9 seconds. The Pan Am aircraft turned hard to the left in an attempt to get clear of the runway. The KLM pilots rotated early, attempting to lift the nose and get airborne before the impact, but the maneuver caused the tail to strike the runway surface, and the aircraft was still not airborne when it reached the Pan Am plane. The KLM 747's engines, lower fuselage, and landing gear tore through the upper right section of the Pan Am aircraft across multiple impact points simultaneously, shearing off the top of the larger plane, while the KLM aircraft came apart from the structural damage and crashed back onto the runway approximately 150 meters further down, catching fire immediately. All 248 people aboard the KLM aircraft died. Of the 396 aboard Pan Am, 61 survived, almost all from the seats in the forward sections that were not directly struck. Total killed, 583 people. When firefighters arrived, they directed their efforts toward the Pan Am wreckage because a secondary explosion had left the KLM aircraft beyond any possibility of rescue. Survivors from the Pan Am plane described the collision as a series of massive impacts in rapid succession and reported crawling through smoke and fire, escaping through gaps torn in the fuselage, and in several accounts, having no memory of how they gotten out of the aircraft at all. The investigation identified the immediate cause as Van Zanten initiating takeoff without clearance. The contributing factors included the fog, the radio interference that masked two critical transmissions, non-standard phraseology used during taxi instructions, the overcrowded airport being operated beyond its design capacity, the dynamic inside the KLM cockpit, where Van Zanten's institutional seniority and reputation created a culture in which his subordinates were reluctant to challenge him directly. Van Zanten's first officer had asked the tower whether the Pan Am aircraft had cleared. He had asked, he received an ambiguous answer, and did not push further. The irony noted in contemporary newspaper coverage was this: Van Zanten, who died in the crash he caused, had been so thoroughly associated with KLM's commitment to safety that his photograph was on the cover of the airline's in-flight magazine, on newsstands across Europe, and on the day of the disaster. The aftermath reshaped global aviation permanently. Standard phraseology for traffic control communications was adopted worldwide. The phrase "cleared for takeoff" was reserved exclusively for actual takeoff authorization. Eliminating the ambiguity that had contributed to the collision, crew resource management training, which teaches crews how to function as a team and how junior members can appropriately challenge captains' decisions, became mandatory across virtually all commercial aviation globally. English was standardized as the universal language of aviation communication, and yet, the next case on this list has a higher single aircraft death toll, a 32-minute ordeal that aeronautical engineers could not replicate in a simulator, and a rescue operation detail that is genuinely difficult to accept. Japan Airlines Flight 123, August 12, 1985. Japan was on the eve of Obon, one of the most important periods in the Japanese calendar, a multi-day holiday in which families across the country return home and gather to honor their ancestors. Every train, bus, and aircraft in Japan was fully booked. Japan Airlines Flight 123 was no exception. When the Boeing 747 SR-46, registered J8119, pushed back from the gate at Tokyo's Haneda Airport at 6:04 p.m., it was carrying 509 passengers and 15 crew. The flight to Osaka was scheduled to take 50 minutes. It was so thoroughly booked that passengers had been calling JAL for weeks, hoping to find a cancellation. 12 minutes after takeoff, as the aircraft climbed through 24,000 feet, there was a sudden explosive decompression at the rear of the aircraft. What had failed was the aft pressure bulkhead, a curved structural wall at the very back of the pressurized passenger cabin that separates the cabin environment from the unpressurized tail section. What had failed, the pressure wave generated by the rupturing bulkhead traveled rearward through the tail with enormous force, destroying the vertical stabilizer, the entire tail fin, and severing all four of the Boeing 747's hydraulic lines. The lines ran through the tail section, all four of them gone. Captain Masami Takahama, First Officer Yutaka Sasaki, and Second Officer Hiroshi Fukuda had no hydraulic pressure. On a Boeing 747, hydraulic pressure controls the ailerons, the elevators, the rudder, and the flaps, meaning every primary control surface on the aircraft. Without it, the crew had no meaningful way to direct where the plane went. The only tool remaining to them was differential engine thrust, varying the power output of individual engines to induce some directional change. The same principle as steering a boat with mismatched oars. It was extraordinarily difficult even in ideal simulator conditions. These were not ideal conditions. For 32 minutes, the crew fought to keep the aircraft flying. The plane rolled into banks as steep as 60 degrees. It dove to 15,000 feet at a rate of 18,000 feet per minute, a rate of descent that in a controlled dive would register as an emergency. The crew pulled it out of the dive, and the aircraft pitched back upward. It carved enormous looping arcs through the airspace north of Tokyo, technically airborne, but uncontrollable in any conventional sense. Aeronautical engineers who later attempted to replicate the crew's performance in flight simulators using the same aircraft type and the same failure scenario found that they could not keep the aircraft airborne for longer than 12 minutes. Takahama and his crew kept it flying for 32. The passengers knew something had gone catastrophically wrong within seconds of the bulkhead failure, the sudden decompression, the visible structural damage to the rear of the cabin, and the terrifying motion of the aircraft made it clear that this was not recoverable. During those 32 minutes, some passengers wrote, on bento box napkins, the backs of business cards, the margins of boarding passes. They wrote to their families. Hirotsugu Kawaguchi was a 47-year-old businessman. His note, addressed to his wife and children, was recovered from the wreckage and returned to his family. It said, "Be good to each other and work hard. Mama, I'm sorry. I love you. Goodbye." It now sits in a museum dedicated to the victims of the crash. At 6:46 p.m., 44 minutes after takeoff, the plane struck the ridge of Mount Takamagahara in the Otsutaka Range at 340 knots, equivalent to approximately 391 miles per hour, at an elevation of about 5,000 feet. The aircraft hit the ridge, broke apart, and came to rest across a debris field roughly 400 meters wide in heavily forested, extremely remote mountainous terrain, 62 miles north of Tokyo. Of the 524 people aboard, 520 died. The 4 survivors were all women, all seated in rows 54 through 60 of the left rear section of the aircraft, the only section of the fuselage that came to rest with some structural integrity remaining. Yumi Ochiai was only 26 years old, an off-duty Japan Airlines flight attendant. Keiko Kawakami was 12 years old, traveling with her parents, both of whom died. She was found the following morning alive in a tree, having been thrown from her seat during the impact. Hiroko Yoshizaki and her 8-year-old daughter, Mikiko, survived together, found in the same section of wreckage. A U.S. Air Force C-130 from Yokota Air Base had been tracking the aircraft on radar throughout its uncontrolled flight. It located the crash site within 20 minutes of impact and passed the exact coordinates to Japanese authorities. A U.S. military helicopter was on standby at Yokota, ready to go the moment it was called. It was never called. Japanese Self-Defense Force helicopters flew over the site after dark, saw no visible signs of life from the air, and turned back. No ground rescue teams were sent up the mountain that night. They went the following morning. It was 14 hours after the impact before anyone physically reached the wreckage. Yumi Ochiai, the flight attendant who survived, gave a formal testimony that was entered into the official record. She stated that she heard voices in the wreckage around her through the night, moaning, calls, sounds of people alive in the darkness of the wreckage, badly injured, bleeding, exposed to the summer mountain air at an altitude with no assistance coming. The official estimate from investigators was that between 20 and 50 people survived the initial impact. None of those individuals were alive when rescue teams arrived the following morning. The cause of all of this traced back 7 years. In 1978, the same aircraft suffered a tail strike at Osaka Airport, and Boeing technicians repaired the damaged pressure bulkhead. The repair required 2 rows of rivets and the splice plate. The technicians used 1. The single error reduced the structural strength of the repair by approximately 70%. Boeing's own post-accident analysis calculated that a bulkhead repaired to that standard could be expected to last around 10,000 pressurization cycles. The aircraft flew 12,319 more cycles after the repair before it failed. 7 years of flights, 12,319 takeoffs and landings, all of them counting down to the same outcome. Boeing publicly accepted responsibility for the faulty repair. Japan Airlines President Yasumoto Takagi publicly accepted institutional responsibility and resigned. Multiple JAL employees died by suicide in the months following the disaster, an expression of the depth of shame that Japanese professional culture attaches to catastrophic institutional failure. The Obon holiday context, the full manifest, the children, the families traveling home, the notes written in the final 32 minutes, all of it embedded August 12, 1985, permanently into Japanese national memory. Among the 520 dead was Kyu Sakamoto, the Japanese pop singer who in 1963 had become the only Japanese artist to ever reach #1 on the American Billboard Hot 100 chart. His song was called, pardon the bad pronunciation, Ue o Muite Aruko, known in the West as Sukiyaki. He was 45 years old. Every year on August 12th, a memorial ceremony is held near the base of Mount Otsutaka. Families of the victims climb toward the crash site to lay flowers. Keiko Kawakami, the 12-year-old girl found alive in a tree, grew up to become a flight attendant for Japan Airlines. This was the deadliest single aircraft accident in history, and it has held that record for 40 years. But the final case in this video does not count its dead in the hundreds. It counts them in the number of thousands, and then it keeps counting. The September 11 attacks, 2001. On the morning of September 11, 2001, 19 men working in coordinated teams boarded 4 commercial airliners at 3 airports. They had purchased seats on transcontinental morning departures from Boston's Logan International Airport, Washington Dulles International Airport, and Newark Liberty International Airport. The selection of transcontinental routes was deliberate. Aircraft departing the East Coast for California in the morning carry their maximum fuel loads, the largest volume of jet fuel a domestic aircraft holds at any point in a journey. 2 Boeing 767s each carried approximately 23,000 gallons. 2 Boeing 757s each carried approximately 11,000 gallons. The aircraft were the weapons. The fuel was the accelerant. The passengers and crew aboard were, by the design of the operation, irrelevant to the outcome. At 8:46 a.m., American Airlines Flight 11, carrying 92 people, including 5 hijackers, struck the North Tower of the World Trade Center between floors 93 and 99 at approximately 440 miles per hour. From the street, from offices across Lower Manhattan, from the windows of the South Tower 131 meters away, the event initially appeared to many observers to be a catastrophic accident, a large aircraft gone impossibly off course. Terrible, but perhaps explicable. That interpretation lasted exactly 17 minutes. At 9:03 a.m., United Airlines Flight 175, carrying 65 people, including 5 hijackers, struck the South Tower between floors 77 and 85 at approximately 590 miles per hour, the fastest speed recorded for a commercial aircraft in low-altitude flight. Television cameras that had been pointed at the burning North Tower since 8:46 captured the second impact from multiple angles simultaneously, and the footage was broadcast live to an audience that by then numbered in the tens of millions. Every person watching understood in that moment what was happening. The fireball was visible from across the city and from aircraft miles away. At 9:37 a.m., American Airlines Flight 77, carrying 64 people, including 5 hijackers, struck the western facade of the Pentagon in Arlington, Virginia, after completing a 330-degree descending turn over the Washington area. The impact destroyed a section of the building that had been recently renovated with blast-resistant windows and reinforced structural elements, a circumstance that may have reduced casualties inside the building from what they might otherwise have been. 125 Pentagon employees and military personnel were killed, in addition to all 64 aboard the aircraft. The fourth aircraft, United Airlines Flight 93, carrying 44 people, including 4 hijackers, had been delayed 42 minutes on the ground at Newark due to routine runway congestion. That delay changed everything for the people aboard it. By the time the hijackers seized control of Flight 93, and the passengers and crew had begun making phone calls to family members on the ground, the World Trade Center towers had already been struck. The passengers of Flight 93 knew what kind of mission their aircraft had been turned into. They organized. Multiple phone calls to family members in the final minutes describe a vote among passengers to attempt to retake the cockpit. The cockpit voice recorder, recovered from the field in Shanksville, Pennsylvania, where the aircraft crashed at 10:03 a.m., captured sounds of the assault from outside the cockpit door. When it became clear to the hijacker at the controls that the passengers were breaking through, he rolled the aircraft inverted and drove it into the ground. The 9/11 Commission determined that the intended target of Flight 93 was the United States Capitol building. All 44 aboard were killed. The South Tower collapsed at 9:59 a.m., 56 minutes after being struck. The North Tower collapsed at 10:28 a.m., 1 hour and 42 minutes after impact. World Trade Center Building 7, a 47-story office building that had not been struck by any aircraft, caught fire from falling debris and collapsed at 5:20 p.m. By the end of the day, 2,977 people from 90 nations were dead. It is the deadliest terrorist attack in recorded history and the deadliest attack on American soil since Pearl Harbor. The intelligence record. The 9/11 Commission's central finding on prior warning was precise. The attacks were not inevitable. They grew from documented failures in intelligence sharing, failures in communication, and what the Commission called a failure of imagination. The agencies responsible for preventing attacks had not seriously considered that Al-Qaeda might use hijacked commercial aircraft as weapons, even though evidence pointing toward exactly that kind of operation already existed inside the system. 36 days before the attacks, on August 6, 2001, President George W. Bush received a presidential daily brief at his ranch in Crawford, Texas. The document has since been declassified and published in full. Its title was Bin Laden Determined to Strike in U.S. It stated that Al-Qaeda maintained an operational presence in New York, that FBI reporting had identified patterns of suspicious activity in the United States consistent with aircraft hijacking preparations, and that bin Laden had been expressing intent to attack inside the country since at least 1997. That briefing did not arrive in a vacuum. Throughout the summer of 2001, the CIA director's threat reporting was described internally, in the language of the Commission itself, as his hair on fire. The broader intelligence system was described as blinking red. Between April and September 2001, the FAA issued 52 information circulars to domestic airlines and airports, warning of an elevated threat environment. None of them specified what form an attack might take, and none produced a change in airport or airline security procedures. In July 2001, an FBI field agent in Phoenix sent a formal memorandum to FBI headquarters flagging that a notable number of men of Middle Eastern origin were enrolled in American civil aviation flight training programs, and arguing that the pattern warranted investigation as a potential Al-Qaeda indicator. FBI headquarters did not act on it. In August 2001, an FBI field office in Minneapolis arrested a French-Moroccan man named Zacharias Moussaoui after a flight instructor reported that he had shown intense interest in learning to fly a large commercial aircraft and no interest at all in learning how to take off or land. Minneapolis agents applied for a warrant to search his laptop. FBI headquarters declined, citing insufficient legal basis. The laptop was searched after September 11th. It contained information directly relevant to the investigation. Two of the eventual hijackers, Nawaf al-Hazmi and Khalid al-Midhar, had been identified by the CIA as Al-Qaeda operatives as far back as January 2000, when both men attended an operational planning meeting in Kuala Lumpur that CIA assets were monitoring. After the meeting, both men flew to Los Angeles, settled in San Diego, and obtained California driver's licenses under their own names. The CIA knew who they were. The FBI's domestic counterterrorism units were never told. Both men boarded American Airlines Flight 77 on the morning of September 11th. The 9/11 Joint Inquiry called the failure to pass this information to domestic law enforcement as one of the most consequential intelligence breakdowns in the entire investigation. The commission was careful to state that none of these failures, taken individually, represents a single moment at which the attacks could have definitely been stopped. The system had been structured in a way that made connecting these signals nearly impossible. Agencies operated behind strict information sharing walls. The domestic counterterrorism structure lacked both the resources and the organizational design to synthesize what was coming in from multiple directions, and the institutional culture across multiple agencies had not adapted to the nature of Al-Qaeda as a threat, one that was patient, distributed, and willing to use methods the system had not been built to anticipate. The Commission's conclusion was a documented systemic failure across multiple institutions, the death toll that is still rising. Every other disaster in this video has an end date. The Hindenburg fire was over in 34 seconds. Tenerife ended in minutes. JAL 123 ended when the aircraft struck the mountain. September 11th ended for 2,977 people that morning and has kept going for hundreds of thousands of others ever since. When the towers collapsed, they released a toxic cloud over lower Manhattan that blanketed the area for days. First responders, recovery workers, and residents were exposed to it throughout the 9-month rescue and recovery operation. Many were told that the air was safe. The EPA issued a public health statement days after the attack saying air quality posed no significant health risk. Public health researchers have since documented that statement as premature and inaccurate. The medical consequences are still accumulating. Cancers, respiratory conditions, and other serious illnesses have been certified as definitively linked to ground zero exposure. And because the most serious cancers associated with that kind of toxic exposure could take 15 to 30 years to fully develop, the population of people getting sick from September 11th is still growing. As of 2023, cumulative deaths from documented 9/11 related illnesses surpassed the 2,977 killed in the attacks. And by 2025, tens of thousands of first responders have been diagnosed with cancers linked to ground zero exposure, and the number continues to rise. The wars launched in direct response lasted 20 years in Afghanistan and 8 in Iraq, and researchers estimate they ultimately led to millions of deaths across multiple countries. Aviation security was overhauled, the TSA was created, and the intelligence system was reorganized in an effort to prevent another attack. The most significant reforms that came out of every disaster in this list were cultural, and cultural changes are harder to sustain than design specifications because they depend on institutional memory, and institutional memory fades. Crew resource management exists because Tenerife demonstrated that a cockpit where a captain's authority goes unchallenged is a cockpit where a fatal mistake goes uncorrected. The normalization of deviance concept exists because Challenger demonstrated that an organization can look at its own safety data for years, find warning signs in it, and gradually train itself to read those signs as normal. The post-Apollo 11 oversight reforms exist because 3 men dying in a sealed cabin demonstrated that a program under deadline pressure will find ways to rationalize warning signs rather than stop and address them. Each of these lessons was hard-won, thoroughly documented, and taught widely. Each of them also eroded over time as the organizations that learned them replaced the people who had lived through them, and the pressure of the next program built back up, and the same patterns reasserted themselves. In almost every case in this video, the warning existed before the disaster. It was written down, spoken aloud, or sitting in an evidence record that someone had access to and did not act on. The question each of these disasters leave behind is the same one. At one point, did the outcome become inevitable, and who was in the room when that decision was made?